Hey everybody. I fully intended on doing a full review of Halo Infinite, and to that end I was going to try to get it done for this week. I figured that I had already played the beta back when it originally released, and so I had a good idea of how the multiplayer worked. I could go through a few more matches to see how it is now, and then of course go through the entire single player campaign, get a full review done, and then move on to the next thing. But what actually ended up happening this week was that I put about 5 hours into the campaign of Halo Infinite, I put a couple of hours into the multiplayer, and then I proceeded to play about 16 hours or so of Baldur's Gate 3, and a couple of hours of Quake 2's remaster. The question there becomes, well, why? Why did I end up not actually getting Halo Infinite's campaign done so I could do a full review? Well, the simple fact of the matter is that Halo Infinite does something that no Halo game up to this point has ever managed to achieve, which is make me completely apathetic towards it. Now, as simple as that fact is, it does warrant some explanation. The first thing you need to understand is that I've never really given much of a crap about the Halo series to begin with, going back to even the very first game. When I first played it, it was the demo of the game on PC after it had been out on console for a couple of years. I had not played the console version up to that point, and I just didn't see why people were so hyped about it back then, because it played like a fairly average first-person shooter at absolute best. It certainly wasn't outright bad, but I did not remotely see why people were acting like it was the best game in the universe. You see, the thing is, I've been primarily a PC gamer since the early 90s. Which means that I have played an awful lot of first-person shooters over the years. I watched that genre go from the most bare-bones stuff imaginable back in the arcade and Atari 2600 days with stuff like Battlezone, on up through stuff like Wolfenstein 3D, and then Doom, and stuff like Duke Nukem and all the other Build Engine games, on through the likes of Quake, Quake 2, Dark Forces 2, Jedi Knight. Really, the list just goes on and on. And as I'm seeing this genre evolve, I'm seeing it go off and do all kinds of different things, and then Halo releases. And it does more or less the same kind of things I'd been seeing other first-person shooters in the genre doing up to that point, and by the time the PC version released in 2003, it felt positively mundane. Again, not necessarily bad, but just not really impressive from a PC gaming standpoint. If I were a console gamer, I could see where I might be impressed by the fact that it's actually a playable first-person shooter on a gamepad. But you need to understand that that's really not saying much, and beyond that, Halo really doesn't have a whole lot going for it. Again, it's not a bad game necessarily, but it's just not a particularly great one either. It's just okay. And since then, the rest of the series has gone through various ups and downs, with really the high point of the series as far as I've seen being Halo Reach, which was just good. It wasn't great, just good. And that brings us to today, where that's the best the series has managed for me. Just a good, overall, first-person shooter. And Halo Reach came out in 2010. That's not a good sign. I mean, it certainly doesn't help that the writing ever since 343 Industries took over has just been completely awful. I mean, for you to really have any idea what the hell was going on in Halo 4, you had to have read several of the books. And as far as I'm concerned, if you have to read additional material outside of a game to understand the story that is going on in the context of the game, the writers have fundamentally failed at telling that story. I mean, think about it this way. Halo 4 has worse storytelling than Tech War. I'm not joking. You can at least understand what's happening in Tech War. It's not explained well, but you at least get the broad strokes. You understand generally what tech is, you understand who the tech lords are, and you understand why you're trying to take them down. That's all you really need to know in Tech War, though. In Halo 4, it's throwing all these terms at you that you have no idea what they are. It throws an entire faction at you that you've never seen before and have no reason to understand. And it's acting like you should care about all the things that are happening when you have no idea what's going on. At least unless you were one of those diehard Halo fans that actually read the books that lead into Halo 4. And I'm not a diehard Halo fan, I'm not a Halo fan at all, so I obviously hadn't read those books, and so I had really no idea what was happening in Halo 4. I just muddled my way through it. Halo 5 I can't really speak for personally because I haven't played it, simply because it's Xbox One and Xbox Series X and S exclusive, and I have neither of those systems. I did briefly play the Forge mode, I did a video on that quite a while ago, but that was all they released on PC, so that's all I've played of Halo 5, I can't really speak for it otherwise. But then we get to Halo Infinite, and all of a sudden you're going up against this faction called the Banished, who casual players of the series will have never seen before, because they were introduced in Halo Wars 2. And they're really not explained very well in Halo Infinite either, so you're just going up against what looks like Covenant as far as you're concerned, so that's what you treat them as, only they just keep getting called the Banished in Halo Infinite because they're technically a separate faction. I don't know what's going on with the Halo storyline anymore, and frankly, I really don't care. I have never really cared about what the storyline in Halo is, but as it's gone on, it's gotten less and less decipherable as they keep making you go off in tangent directions trying to figure out what's going on. It's an awful lot like the Kingdom Hearts series in that regard, where the original game was actually very simple, and then they just kept making things more and more ridiculously complicated as they continue throughout the series, to the point where if you want to understand what's going on in the latest game, Kingdom Hearts 3, you have to have played through every single previous game in this series, including all of the handheld spin-offs and such. Because otherwise it'll be throwing all these terms and characters and things like that at you that you've never seen before because you haven't gone through all of the gazillion handheld games that they threw out for that series. Halo finds itself in a similar position now, where the writers at 343 are pulling information from books and comics and whatever, as well as the spin-off games like Halo Wars 1 and 2, both of which are strategy games I might add, and thus are something that your average Halo fan would not even remotely consider playing, and so they're just making it harder and harder to understand what's happening in the Halo series from one game to the next. I mean, I completely skipped over Halo 5, and I can guarantee you from the summaries I've read of Halo 5's storyline that going from Halo 4 to Halo Infinite is as much of a jump of what is even happening here as it is from Halo 5 to Halo Infinite. And look, I know that writing has really never been a strong suit for the Halo series to begin with, but ever since 343 took over, it's just been spiraling into awfulness further and further with each subsequent game. Halo Infinite is just the latest in that sequence, and it has just gone to the point where I simply cannot care about the writing at all anymore. That means that ultimately what I really cared about with Halo Infinite was what they were doing with the gameplay mechanics and the level design or story progression. And that's where Halo Infinite completely falls apart, at least in terms of campaign, because instead of sticking to the series' roots and going with a more linear story progression, they decided that they had to make it open world. Not really because it actually benefits the game in any real way, but because that's what the current trends are, because the current trend in gaming is to keep player retention high, and they think that they can do that by throwing in a bunch of side activities to go on in addition to the main story content. And like with most AAA developed games, that means that instead of it actually being meaningful side content that's interesting to go on with its own interesting storylines or quest lines, it's all just a bunch of the same handful of very bland activities. You go to a location, there is a squad of UNSC Marines that needs your help. You fight off a bunch of banished forces. Then the mission's over, you get some points for unlocking things, and then you move on. Or you go to an FOB. You clear out the FOB of the rather small number of enemies that guard it. This now becomes a fast travel point that you can go to and then replenish some of your weapons and ammo, or spawn a vehicle and have a couple of the Marines that are hanging around the FOB join you on that vehicle. And then you can take them with you to go on one of the other types of side activities, which are hunting down high-value targets, which is to say, they're mini-bosses, and by that I mean they're just enemies that you fight normally, but with way more health and shields, and usually a particularly powerful weapon. Oh, and if you take out all of their lackeys, then they'll call in reinforcements and just drag out the fight even further, so you take down the mini-boss first, then all of their lackeys, and then you move on to the next thing. And then, of course, the most involved of the various side activities are the effectively fortress raids, where there's a heavily fortified enemy position. You go there, you destroy a few of the enemy's resources that happen to be there, and then you move on to the next thing. And if you're looking for something that's not one of those 4 missions, it will be just tracking down Spartan cores, which are just upgrade points, or tracking down Mjolnir armor containers that will give you cosmetic unlocks for the multiplayer, or tracking down audio logs. It's basically the same kind of crap you see in pretty much every Ubisoft open world game for the past decade or so, only they've slapped the Halo license on it. This kind of stuff has been really tiresome for years, and yet Halo Infinite just perpetuates this, and more importantly, it makes the combat even more long and drawn out and tedious than it already was. This is something I've really had a problem with in the series right from the get-go. It always felt like the combat was way more slow and tedious than it really should be, given that most of the enemies really actually aren't all that threatening in the Halo series. But because of the way they've set it up, where a lot of the enemies have energy shields that you just have to bring down before you can dome them, or you have enemies that just can take a surprisingly high amount of damage unless you headshot them, it just tends to drag everything out far longer than it really should. That's not to say that there isn't enemy variety in Halo Infinite, because there is some degree of it, about as much as you would see in any other Halo game. But that's not saying all that much. I mean, the enemies aren't all that interesting to fight, and at the end of the day, you're still running around with a 2-weapon limit, one of which is going to be a gun that is capable of getting headshots because it's basically necessary for the way Halo plays, and the other of which is going to be whatever else you can find at any given point that happens to have ammo and is moderately useful. Movement is still a bit on the slower side, although it's definitely not as slow as the old school Halo games, so it's not quite as tedious to navigate the environments. But you definitely don't get that breakneck action feel that you get from, say, a retro-style first-person shooter, or pretty much anything that's designed for PC for that matter. And the addition of a grappling hook feels like a, hey, we can do it too, see, more than anything else. They do give you a couple of other suit abilities to mess around with as well, but it's all implemented in a relatively clumsy manner, probably because they had to make it work on gamepads, and making multiple suit abilities that you can switch back and forth between at a moment's notice is just not really going to be intuitive for a first-person shooter using a gamepad. You can easily do it on PC with a keyboard, but with a gamepad, you've got to make sacrifices, and they clearly did for Halo Infinite. The end result of all of this is just that Halo Infinite doesn't really feel like a coherent experience. It's like they took a bunch of elements that were from other games and tried to shoehorn them into Halo in order to try to make it relevant to an audience that doesn't really want those things in Halo to begin with, and doesn't really benefit from having them either. Just chasing trends and hoping that would stave off the Reaper for just a bit more. But the simple fact of the matter is that at this point, Halo's basically doomed for mediocrity. It always really was fairly mediocre, but at least back in the early to mid 2000s, console first-person shooters were still something of a mess, and developers were still trying to figure out how exactly to make them work well on the platforms. By the time Halo Reach came out, most developers had figured that kind of thing out, so the only thing that was really holding the Halo franchise up was brand recognition. And at this point, that's really turned against them. People aren't seeing Halo as an industry leader anymore. They're just seeing it as a tired franchise that is increasingly falling victim to the same kinds of things that are making so many other AAA games less and less interesting as time goes on. More emphasis on player retention over actual quality of content, so they can just continually drip feed a minimal amount of content to make it seem like they're actually doing something with it, only for them to really be focused way more on monetizing the living crap out of the game's cosmetics and such, rather than deliver a compelling game experience. And that's pretty much where I'm at with Halo at this point. I mean, I know my history with the franchise has not exactly been positive for the most part. I mean, the only game in the entire series I would actually recommend to people is Halo Reach, after all. But that doesn't mean I want Halo to fail. What I want is for it to get better and actually learn from the series' mistakes and move forward. And 343 Industries has just not been doing that. And if all they're going to be doing is chasing trends and monetizing their games because it's all corporate mandated assembly line production nonsense these days, then why should anybody care about what they're doing? The answer is, you shouldn't care about what they're doing. There are so many other games out there that actually had passion put into them, that the developers really cared about. They had a clear vision from start to finish, and even if they weren't able to achieve that vision optimally, they still put enough heart and soul into it that you can look past the issues that it has. Or at the very least, there's something to appreciate about those games. Halo Infinite, on the other hand, is like staring into a void. It's like there's just nothing there, or at least nothing of substance, and so I just can't recommend Halo Infinite to anybody, whether you're a diehard fan of Halo or not. You'd just be better served playing pretty much anything else, and if you must play a Halo game, just pick up the Master Chief Collection. At least you're getting a lot more bang for your buck there with all of the different games in it, and at least one of those games I actually do recommend to a more general audience, that being Halo Reach. But as for me, well, I've got plenty of other projects that I was working on, so I'm going to just go ahead and get right back to those and actually find some stuff that's interesting to talk about rather than something that's basically like staring into the void like Halo Infinite. Thank you all very much for watching. If you like my videos, please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. If you can't afford to or don't want to, that's perfectly fine, I understand, but the option's there if you're interested. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you all in later videos.